Damp return. She learned the new damp before she learned the patrons. It rode in on the books and on the sleeves that slid them forward over the desk, a thin chill that threaded the cloth and sat in the crease of her elbow. Each return left a ring. Some rings were faint, like a breath on glass. Some were black and steady, as if the paper itself had sweated ink. She kept the blotter flat and didn't change it for longer than the guidebook said, because it had started to do something for her. It coaxed her. When she let a returned book rest where it wanted, the stain that book made lightened first at its edges, as if relieved to have arrived. If she misread, if she pushed the book aside and stacked on habit, the wet mark went stubborn and dark. She could feel the blotter becoming her quiet accomplice, a second set of fingers pointing. Nora Vale worked the desk at the Carrow Springs Public, which was not a grand building and not a new one. The carpet had a looped pattern that remembered every push of a cart. The paint on the back door had bubbled where sun hit it most of the day. Squirrels owned the oak outside the reading room. They ran the same line across the ledge and tapped their paws against the glass just to hear the hollow sound. She was new in the way anyone could be new to a place that had its own humidity and its own worn corners and its own private inventory of small noises. Since she had started, the maintenance sign over the service window had been a steady presence. Handwritten, clipped with a magnet shaped like a crab, it said the machine that pulled water from the air was waiting on a part from far away. The script leaned, a little rushed. Someone had underlined the word sorry. The ink had bled. Her first mornings came early before the doors opened. She slid keys in the lock and felt the metal stick for a slow heartbeat. Lights hummed alive in strips, a wash of soft headache. The stamp pad stuck to her thumb when she pressed it to check the date. Even without rain, the entry mat gave off the smell of a used mop. She would start coffee in the staff room and stare at the drip that never quite pinched off from the faucet, listening to it collect, listening to it become a smaller sound inside the larger room. Routine made a neat perimeter around her. She tacked up the day's children's hour sheet. She counted the fine money in the black drawer and stirred the coins into a stack with the side of a finger. She ran the barcodes of the first returns past the scanner and went to the book truck, arranging spines to head out to the lanes between shelves. The building's temper showed itself in small and inconsistent ways. The reading lamps clicked, the copy machine warmed and then forgot and then warmed. One of the fixtures in the ceiling carried a trapped mosquito she could not reach, and it made a thready wing sound when the tubes lit, a shawl of static that seemed to gather over the tables. Outside, the sky might be bright, might be clean, but inside, Nora felt the gentle cling of a basement that had learned to stand upright. She felt it in her hair and in the space under her lower lip. She felt it most when she lingered in the aisles, which had their own weather, slipping cooler and then warmer at hard-to-map points. On her third afternoon, a patron handed over a novel whose cover had buckled like dry paint. He slid it forward with an apologetic shrug, though he said nothing. The book left a round place on the blotter, darker than the rest. It took longer than usual to fade. Nora lifted the book and set it again, a hair to the left. The stain shifted its insistence, but did not lighten. She tried a spot closer to the edge of the desk. Only when she gave in to the tug she had begun to feel the quiet pull the blotter had taught her, did the dark ring begin to dissolve, like a bruise breathed through. It became a habit she did not confess. She followed the wet guidance and found that the books wanted to cluster for a time. Returns slowed and waited for each other as if they had been out together in the same weather. The stain would lighten only when the second or third of the group arrived. Other days, the blotter wanted things dispersed, and she sent them off to different carts, feeling a patient pride that she could understand what a watermark was trying to say. She told herself it was just her, finally hearing the library. Any job had this to it, the way things spoke once you shut up. The head librarian, Evelyn March, was dry to the bone. grey hair gathered tight, sleeves rolled in tidy cuffs. She walked with a measured step that seemed to bruise dust into order. She did not see damp as a voice. She saw it as a budget, as the cost of a part that had to cross the continent. She let the dehumidifier note hang another day and reminded everyone to keep their mugs on coasters. When she stood with Nora to watch a patron question the copy machine's error light, her mouth held a tight distrust of the machine's motives, as if it might be lying deliberately. "Paper runs wetter in air like this," she said at one point, not unkindly. "The fuser can't decide if it has done enough." Nora nodded, though the word fuser meant less than the soft things she was learning, the in-between words the blotter made visible. She felt an odd guilt, like keeping company with someone Evelyn could not hear. Nora lived in a rented top half of a duplex down by the truck stop. Nights brought a heavy quiet, and the distant slide of tires on pavement slick with bug bodies and dripped diesel. She bought groceries at a place where the freezer clogged up sound as soon as she opened it. She learned to sleep with her window cracked, hoping to let the room breathe. When she dreamed she was inside the aisles, there was no fear at first. There was the patient logic of alphabet and subject matter, the way things slid into place only one way. In the dream, she would stand with her hand on her spine and feel an answer move through her palm, a slow coolness, a not yet. She woke with her knuckles cold. Patrons were their own weather, a man with a neck like a stump who asked for repair manuals and left a salt circle on the desk with his forearms. A woman who spoke up for the poetry that the town pretended not to want, who returned her books in a plastic bag as if bringing in contraband. A teenager with a cracked phone and damp hair who asked for the code to the study room and then sat in there not using it, staring at his shoes, breathing the space into fog. Even the children knew something about the damp. They pressed their hands to the aquarium that housed the guppies and giggled at the lip prints their mouths made in the condensation on the glass. When the first of the maps formed, the blotter had been freshly changed. She had not wanted to lose the old pattern, but the corner had picked and curled, and she knew Evelyn would catch it. She laid down a new sheet, smooth as she could, and flattened it with her palm. That evening, returns came like a rain that had learned to walk in single file. Each book set down with a hesitation, a show of humility, and then the wet ring formed with a firmness that almost made a sound. Not a drip, but a soft arrival. The circles touched, then overlapped, then left open slivers between, like streets. Nora found a path in it. If she traced the pale islands with her finger, she could see a line that moved through them, narrower here, wider there. The feeling it gave her was tug and permission. She looked at the clock, read the hands as late enough to conjure quiet, and turned the key to lock the doors. Keeping the lights on was not against a rule, but it felt private. The building hummed and breathed. The aisles took on more body when no one filled them. The darker corners drew in, as if expecting a guest. Nora rolled the cart down the main run and let her shoes decide how they would sound. Her soles made a dry rasp, then fell to silence on the thin carpet. A cooling came to her, like a hand over the back of her neck. The blotter's suggestion wanted her higher, then left, then toward the far end where the carpet held a permanent cool that the vacuum never warmed. Biographies had a different smell, glue and old cologne. Gardening ran wetter even on dry days. She slid a last cool copy into a gap that had waited with a patience she felt in her teeth. She heard at the desk, far behind her, a long, slow lifting, paper parting from the wood. The blotter pursed. She went back and found every circle dissolved but one, darker and wide as her open hand, laid exactly where she stood when she said hello to anyone who came in. She stood there because the room had built her a small stage and the rug S-nap had trained her heels. The ring asked her. She knew the question without words. Where do you belong? She did not answer. She wiped the monitor and straightened the pencils and emptied the little dish where paper clips added themselves. She took the blotter up despite Evelyn's wishes and blotted the ring onto her skin. It left no mark. The next morning, the head librarian came in early, which she rarely did unless an audit waited or a delivery had been threatened. She lifted her eyebrows at Nora's already full cart and at the tidy desk and at the empty space where the blotter usually lay. "Dry as it's going to get," Nora said. And because she had to say something for balance, she added, "We were heavy on returns last night." Evelyn nodded. "The machine man called. The part is somewhere it has no business being." She meant the water-pulling machine, and she meant a warehouse a day's drive away, and she meant there would be another week at least of soft air. "Mind the downstairs closes early today. I don't want anyone lingering in the archives if that smell comes up again." The downstairs had its own personality. Concrete under carpet, history in boxes, the county's photographed past tucked into sleeves that stuck together. The air at the bottom step always shifted. On her first week, Nora had not liked it. She had gone with one of the volunteers, a retired nurse who smelled like lemon cleaner and carried her own pencil sharpener, to find a specific newspaper roll for a man who believed an ad would settle a family argument. She had felt then a pull toward the far wall, as if the stacks there were half a step farther away than they looked. She could not explain it to herself and had set it down under newness and nerves. After the blotter map, she stopped filing it that way. Downstairs, in the back corner, stood a freestanding unit, a machine donated by the Friends of the Library years back. It was supposed to drink the air and leave the room able to breathe easier. It had a narrow window that showed a thin line of water. Now, unplugged, it held its bit of captured weather like a stubborn memory. A loop of extension cord sagged from the wall outlet where the sign hung. The crab magnet had bruised the paper. There was a small puddle under the cord's lowest point, as if the cord itself perspired. Patrons were not meant to go down without staff, and that rule held even for curious children. Still, the basement had a way of receiving people. You could be reshelving atlases and look up and find a boy standing at the end of the row as if he had been waiting forever. On the day after the first map, Nora brought a paperback and a dictionary and a biography of a bluesman to their homes, and then walked the center aisle without the cart, listening. The overheads buzzed in a tired way. The room smelled of paste and just emptied bathwater. A sound like drying reached her at a diagonal. She did not smell the mold Evelyn feared, but she could smell something like wet wood that had been moved, the backside of a dresser pressed to the wall too long. She felt the urge to put her palm against that far stack, to find where it wanted her to be. When she came back up, the circulation desk felt taller. The blotter she had not returned remained absent without apology. The call bell had developed a reluctance. It gave a dull thud when tapped. The clipboard where she kept the interlibrary requests had grown heavier on its hook. She could feel words blooming under her thumb as she flipped pages, the ink still sinking. That afternoon, in a pause, she took the blotter she had removed and held it at an angle to the light. Old circles showed in pale shadow, even though she had watched them vanish. The map had a memory. She traced an old path and felt the way the motions returned, a small heat. When she laid it down again, a faint ring formed by itself, without a book, like a thought condensing. She began, when she could, to shelve by feel. Her hands learned how bends in the carpet became advice. She let catalogue numbers float. She walked the aisles and read their temperatures with her forearms. A coolness against the fine hairs on her skin told her when she stood in the right place. A thicker damp stood against her cheek when she misread. That was not magic. She told herself it was no more magic than a cashier learning to hear a counterfeit beat in a till full of bills. Still, she kept it close and kept it quiet. The library was a place of rules, and yet every rule had an older companion. You learned only by working here. Silence was not quiet. It had a shape and a purpose and a weight like damp wool. The second map did not form by accident. It did not appear and ask. It built itself in front of her as if she had been tested and not failed. The returns came in a run, cracked craft manuals, a slender new release still smelling like a press, a flood of cookbooks with pages warped at the corners as though they had been held over steam. Each book placed itself both reluctantly and eagerly. Nora found she could stand away from the desk and see the circles forming with a clarity she had not had before. Overlap led her eye. She watched the map pattern lay out a route she recognized, a walk she had taken without thinking. It moved her past biographies and toward gardening again, over the cold carpet place where the air went thin. She followed with the cart. She watched the books ride her forward like a current. There was a gap waiting that had not existed at midday. She knew this because she kept a private inventory inside her head. It came from shelving in the same building for enough days in a row. If a spine went missing or a volume lay flush when it had been proud the day before, she felt it as surely as a missing tooth. The gap sat between a book on composting and a history of irrigation in the county. It was not a wide absence, but its sides were damp to the eye, as if another book had just slid through and carried the wet with it. Around the gap, the other spines beaded with water. It looked like a breath had been held there and then released. She slid a midweight volume into the opening. It seated home with a neat click. As she did, a coolness spread along her knuckles, up her wrist, into the fat pad of her palm. There was a satisfaction in it that did not belong to her. Something in her stopped. She held her hand out and turned it in the fluorescent light. The cooling went away at once, as if only contact allowed it. She looked down the aisle, past the end cap, into the wider space. No one else was there. The table in the children's corner stood clean and empty. She could smell crayons and old Graham crackers and that peculiar scent the fish tank made when both the heater and the bubbler ran at once, a warm, briny plastic. Upstairs, a minute later, ink lifted itself from the blotter, scattering softly like rain. Patrons began bringing their own damp. They arrived with sweater sleeves wet to the elbow, even on days when the sky outside was a light bleached blue, and the blackbird on the curbside wire puffed its chest and sang a drier song. A woman in a brown jacket pressed her palms to the desk and left 2 coasters of moisture, perfect as proof coins. She did not apologize for it because she did not notice. The man with the neck like a stump grew friendlier and spoke once in a voice that scraped at first, and then found itself telling Nora about the creek near the rail yard that had always had a slick to it in summer, a film that would not break when you touched it with a stick that pulled back only when you pushed a branch straight down and held it a long time. It went flat, he said, if you kept your hand on it. He flattened his hand now on the desk to show her what he meant and left a print that took long minutes to fade. If anyone said the word mold, it was in the tone people here saved for illness you did not say out loud. If anyone noticed the carpets grew cold at the turn near the far window, they called it shade. Nora said neither word and kept her own catalogue. She fed back her doubt to the steady appetite of routine. Open the doors, log the returns, listen for the drip that hovers just before it falls. Wipe the water rings from tables and keep the blue bucket with the cloth draped over it, tucked under the desk where she could reach it. The cloth did little more than spread damp around, but it gave the appearance of control, and that counted for something. Evelyn accepted this because any appearance that held the day together counted. The town stuttered forward as if it too had damp in its gears. Notices appeared in windows. We are short-staffed. We are sorry for the inconvenience of closing early. We will open again when we may. The post office ran the fans. The hardware store kept the aisle with pipe and glue taped off after a pipe joint failed, and a lash of water had slapped the ceiling tile. People talked about the river, not because it had risen, but because it existed nearby, shouldering the town without looking at it. The water was the color of split green beans and smelled like iron filings and coins. It ran low by habit, except when it surprised everyone. It never needed to be here to be part of the air. Nora had grown up 2 counties over, where the ground grew coarse grass and blue dust, and saw summer in hard light, and she still thought of that as normal. Here, normal was soft. Even the sun here felt like it had been wrapped in eggshell paper. In this softness, firmness began to assert itself. The firm was not loud. It did not bark rules. It just slipped into place in the shape of gaps that did not belong, chill patches that sat for hours like wet footprints where no one had walked. There was the day the microfilm cabinet refused to find the right roll until Nora forgot the numbers, closed her eyes, and let her fingers trail the handles. She ended touching the exact drawer and pulling to see a tightening inside the spool that said yes. There was the morning she traced the shelving slip for a reference book, found the letter section empty of that title, and turned to leave, only to feel the air at her back thicken. The book lay misshelved 2 paces away. She would have assumed human error, if not for the sheen along its top edge. It gleamed as if it had just been set down by hands that drank moisture. She noticed other things. The stapler at the children's S table failed to close on the last millimeter, as if resisting the deed. Then, with a small, resigned press, it bit, and the 2 sheets married. The copy machine asked for paper even when full. A knock at the tray persuaded it to believe. The walkie that staff used to call downstairs cracked with static that sounded in rhythm with the slow drip that collected under the unplugged unit. The handheld scanner at the desk sang its red tone a hair off pitch in the first hour of the day, as if it tuned itself upright by noon. In all these things, she felt a pattern, not one she could have explained to anyone who wasn't standing exactly where she was. Evelyn noticed fatigue before she noticed shape. She came to Nora with a neat ledger of overtime and asked if she needed to go home early. She said the word home like rest, like a prescription. Nora said no. The day was already more than half used, and the afternoon was always easier. This was a lie that came without effort. The afternoon was not easier. It was only less obvious in its intent. In the afternoon, the building grew steadier, and when it grew steady, it felt closer to speaking. Nora liked that. It kept her in the frame of the doorway, in the square of the desk where the last of the older rings still showed as an off-color bruise. One evening, 2 men from the county came through with a hand meter in a case with foam cutouts. They were friendly and joked about the river's moods and wore boots that remembered cornfields. They held the meter up to corners and said the air was wetter here than there and asked where the machine was. Nora took them downstairs. They stood in front of the unplugged unit and nodded as if the very shape of it proved something. They filled a form with a felt pen whose tip squeaked. The meter made no sound Nora could hear. She waited for some small acknowledgement that this was not ordinary, that the air had learned them and was hiding its breath. The men thanked her and left a notice for Evelyn to file. She watched them walk away through the front windows, and their shoulders looked easy in the bright heat outside. The 3rd map came without warning. Nora was alone at the desk, while Evelyn took an early dinner, and the volunteer nurse had gone to the post office, trying for a package that always promised it would arrive today, and then did not. The returns were not heavy. The phones were quiet. The air had a stillness that made the lights seem louder. The blotter began to show circles without contact. Nora stood and watched the pale rings develop one by one, taking shape as if tightened by an invisible wick. The path they made was different this time. It did not ask for the sunny run near the windows or the chilly pass behind gardening. It made for the staff door, the one that opens to a narrow hallway that leads to the back stacks, and the office no one wants, because it shares its wall with the proof of everything, concrete and pipe and the sound of water in a vein you cannot find. She could have ignored it. She could have put a hand over the blotter like covering a child's eyes. Instead, she turned the latch on the staff door and felt the heavy light of that hallway press against her. It smelled of metal. It smelled of the ghost of a raincoat. The hallway carried its own line of damp. Where shoes had walked for years between desk and back rooms, a dim polish showed. At the point where the hall kinked left, the polish had a different quality, as if it had been shined by something that didn't wear rubber. Nora found herself thinking of how a book chose a shelf. It didn't, of course. A person chose it. A system older than her chose it. And yet she had seen spines lean toward one another after they had been placed, covers and covers seeking company they had not been assigned. Who could say that choosing did not have a whisper of want in it? She walked the hallway to its bend, and then paused, listening to the wire rattle in the wall and a far sound that might have been the glug of a jug turning upright. She could feel a coolness at her temple, as if someone's breath were very close. She took another step and stood in the shadow of the old bulletin board that held staff notices. There was the list for emergency contacts, the scammers to warn patrons about, the cat that had been seen under the book drop and taken in by the woman with the brown jacket. A tack had rust trailed from it. The paper under that tack had a pale watermark, neither the shape of a coffee mug nor a thumb. It looked like the outline of an oval face. The back stacks hold books that no one asks for, except once in a while. They hold town directories older than anyone in the town. They hold lyrics from school plays from the era when girls had their hair curled with iron rods heated on stoves. The air back there felt like it would go cold with an ordinary decision. Nora stood and debated, turning around. The blotter's map was a pressure at the back of her neck, as real as a hand. On another day, she might have resisted it just to prove that her spine was still her own. Today, she obeyed, not because she feared, but because she was sleepy in the particular way that comes from too many small calculations. Letting the path decide for her was a kind of rest. It was not dramatic. There was no violent change in temperature or smell. The difference was in the attention that the room paid to her. The stacks opened at an angle she had not known they could open. The space between gardening and local history seemed to lengthen. A gap formed. It did not wait for a book. It waited for attention. One of the old wooden chairs sat slightly skewed, as if someone had pushed away and left in a hurry. Her mouth tasted faintly of coins. Her shoes on the thin carpet made no sound at all. She was not afraid. She was busy with the act of noticing. She slid her hand along the shelf. She felt moisture gather along her fingers, no more dramatic than standing near a pot of water that is just about to boil. Her hand found the cold place. It was not exactly cold, only still. The gap's sides were damp to sight and to touch. She thought of her blotter and how the ring on it had asked her a question. The shelves asked nothing. They expected. She stayed like that long enough that a hairline of chill traveled up her arm. She pulled her hand back and rubbed it on her jeans and found the denim damp. She backed away and watched the gap fill with the same patience with which it had opened. The spines on either side leaned gently and then stood true. A long breath she had not known she had been holding left her chest. In that moment, the urge came on her to stand very still and let go, to give a portion of weight to the space around her, to stop insisting on the narrow thread of motion that kept her from being filed away. The urge passed. She left. At the desk, she found a small pool of water under the handbell. She lifted the bell and inverted it, and let the water pour onto the blotter. It spread in a neat round shape, without pressure, without any book laid there. The ring began to lighten on its own. When Evelyn returned, hair pinned tighter, face folded into the kind of cheer that pretends to be for the other person, Nora was already returning books to the cart and rinsing the coffee pot and acting ordinary. Even ordinary had to shift. The town issued a short note through its own channels, as if embarrassed to have formal channels at all. It asked that ventilation be watched and windows opened when possible and basements checked. It asked for reports of unusual damp. It did not define unusual. The librarian reading the note in the staff room laughs at the way the county had chosen to say nothing and everything at once. Evelyn shrugged and posted the note to the board. The crab magnet finally broke. She replaced it with a clothespin that pinched the paper as if it were a throat. Nora called her father and asked about the damp in the farmhouses he knew. He spoke of cellars where apple bins sweated, and of prairie winds that scrubbed the house to its bones, and of a house that had molded under a roof leak so slow no one could find it for years. He did not speak about water-finding mines. He did not have a vocabulary for a blotter's insistence or a shelf that expected. So she listened, grateful for the barn talk, grateful for the small clatter of his ashtray and the squeak of the stool where the lacquer had gripped his jeans for decades. She hung up and felt the same weight return to her as she felt at the desk when the bell thumped dull. Behind her, the fish tank bubbled. A small body rose and fell and rose and fell, as if it were learning how to sleep. Days passed as the type that blur but leave residue. Threads showed in the carpet where a cart's wheels caught on loops loosened by too many turns. The printer coughed and cleared its throat and pretended it had not had a moment. A teenager returned a book with a page stuck, and when Nora tried to part the pages, she felt their reluctance, like fingers folded together by a tired child. Fingertips, she thought. These are all of someone's fingertips, pressed into the building long enough that you forget they are there. She washed her hands and stood with them under the hand dryer and watched the skin on her forearms pull. Her body felt like a book that had been out too long. A morning came when the sky trusted itself enough for sun, and for a few hours the room's lines looked sharper. Then early afternoon, the sun backed away without giving the windows time to adjust. The fluorescents found their own authority, and the aisles took the color of paper left by an open window. In that light, the gap happened again. This time it opened not along gardening, but in the reference section where the atlases sit and pretend they are whole worlds. Nora stood 3 paces away and felt her knees think of kneeling. She did not. She watched instead. The gap's damp edges gleamed. It felt like a mouth had been opened ahead of speech. The urge to place something in it came on strong and lucky. She looked at the cart and saw a book she had not chosen, a book that had arrived itself. It was an old civic code, a tidy volume printed when type had its own wet smell of oil and wool. She did not ask how it had got onto her cart. She slid it into the damp opening and felt for a bare long second the library breathe. The blotter agreed. It went pale, even where old circles had set and said nothing elsewhere. That night, when all had left and the lights hung on, ready to be shut off, Nora walked the aisles one more time. She was not checking, she was visiting. The shelves made a hush around her that she knew in her ribs. There was a place between biographies and gardening where the air cooled and then warmed and then cooled again, as if the building could not make up its mind what season it wanted to hold. She slowed and let the slow place hold her. In the quiet, she heard the smallest tick of a drop, finding plastic, far off and patient. She felt and did not fear the certainty that something stood beside the cork of that noise, listening as she listened. At home, she dreamed again in the new way, not a nightmare, not fear. The feeling in the dream was of being arranged. She stood in a space that had decided to include her and waited for the signal to sit. The signal did not come. It did not forget her. It perfected its delay. She smelled glue and knew it as animal. She woke and felt the understanding float away the way a sound floats when you surface from a dive. Lying still, she tried to hold it. When her head moved even a fraction, the understanding slid off. She told the ceiling out loud that she would not give up anything. Morning routine felt slightly miscued, as if the muscle memory had shifted overnight into a new arrangement. The coffee tasted of metal, the stamp pad wanted to cling. She did the counts and filed the slips, and read the interlibrary list with the ease of muscle memory, pretending it was still true. When the first patrons arrived, she felt them as other kinds of books. The woman in the brown jacket left her palms on the desk a long time as she asked about a novel she hadn't read since she was a young person. When she lifted her hands, the print stayed, cooling her eyes. The man with the stump neck stood farther back than usual and didn't smile. He looked toward the back, toward the hallway where staff walked. His mouth had a set to it that Nora decided not to read. Evelyn returned from a meeting with a man from the county and a sheaf of forms that asked for counts of returns and counts of hours, and a weekly tally of how many of those hours had been spent in rooms with windows open. She tapped the sheaf into alignment against the desk and tasked Nora with the numbers. "They want proof," she said, as if she meant it kindly. "They want to show their own people what they have done. They will count and count." Nora nodded. She had nothing to offer Evelyn for the thing that was actually happening, so she would give her columns and lines and believe that paper could form a dam. The blotter kept its old marks and made no new ones that day. Patrons came steady, wet sleeve to sleeve. The copier refused and then consented. The fish tank bubbled. A child ran and was corrected by a mother in a voice that did love as apology. At late afternoon, in a lull that came like a church breath, the walkie broke open with a slither of static and a voice that meant the nurse volunteer. Nora lifted the unit and listened. The voice did not form words at first, then came into itself without quite traveling the distance. "Downstairs," she said, "come look." Nora went with her hand on the rail, the basement lights limning the exposed pipe in a weak and particular way. The volunteer stood with her hand on her hip and with her head cocked as if the room were a dog that had decided on a new trick. "Hear it?" she asked, and Nora did. A soft patter on the far side of the cabinets, a river's sound made miniature, then the sound stopped like a switch. The two women stood and listened to the silence. After a moment, Nora said they would leave it for the county man to come back to, and the volunteer nodded and held her pencil, and the quiet gathered again like a coat laid over a chair. In the quiet, Nora heard the building choose. The decision did not make a sound. It rearranged the aisle's temperature by a hair. It made a place under her tongue taste of something like old pennies. It reminded her that the first question had already been asked. The ring where she stood at the desk had already said it. "Where do you belong?" That evening, she stayed past the hour when she might have left. She wiped the tables. She told the fish good night. She stood in the doorway and watched the dark press the windows. Then she turned back and walked to the blotter. She pressed her palm to it. She kept her hand there a long time. When she lifted it, the paper showed no wet mark. She did it again. Nothing. The desk was dry as a fact. The blotter was not going to tell her this time. It had already told her what it could. She walked the aisles by habit and attention. In biographies, the air cooled. In gardening, it did not. She turned a corner and found the gap waiting, open between the atlases again, gleaming with a careful damp, as if someone had polished the inner edges with breath. Her hand lifted on its own, without permission from any committee of sense. She touched the shelf and found a stillness more complete than any cool. It was not cold. It was not warm. It was the temperature of paper, kept in a place that held it dear. She felt from the edge of her fingers to her shoulder, and then to the place under her collarbone, where a person feels the smallest fear, that the library could hold weight beyond books. She did not step forward. She did not step away. She breathed and watched. She thought of the desk. She thought of the ring that had waited where she stood when she said hello. She thought of the quiet kindness of old paper in hands that have not been kind to much else. She thought briefly, and without liking that she had thought it, of what it might be to be shelved and to be at rest. She thought that rest starts looking like surrender when the days grow tired. She told herself she would never give in to loneliness dressed as a stack. The gap stayed open. The aisles breathed as if the room had been turned out to pasture. She waited long enough for doubt to build, then long enough for doubt to grow bored, then longer still, until doubt built its nest and fell asleep. The building held her the way a pocket holds a coin. She stood and knew in that bone place that very soon she would be asked to answer with more than a palm against paper. Very soon the question would come again more directly. Where do you belong? She walked away before it came, not as retreat, but as a proof to herself of a thing she needed to know could still be true. Her shoes made a soft whisper against the carpet, as if the loops thanked her for the restraint. She shut off the lights and locked the door and turned her face to the air that had grown heavy with the smell of warm tar from the roadworks nearby. In the last of the light there, a moth made a slow, uncertain figure on the glass. She told herself she had won something, she could not name it. In bed, she felt her weight balanced and evenly distributed the way a book rests on a shelf that matches its height. She slept and dreamed a hallway with no end and only one bend. And around that bend, the sense not of someone waiting, but of a form built to receive. Under the desk at the library all night, the blotter did not map. It sat and absorbed. The little dish for paper clips caught a drop from somewhere and held it exactly. The stapler did not shift. The bell dried from the inside out. In the morning when she returned, the handprint she had tried and failed to leave was faintly present, new, a shade darker than the paper around it. It lay exactly where she stood to greet people, a perfect oval of her palm, set like a seal. It did not dry, it did not ask. It only waited, polite as thanks. The handprint waited where she stood to greet people. It darkened when she walked in from the morning glare, as if glad to see her, then held steady. She took her keys from the drawer and felt the rubber of the key ring tack against her palm. She pressed the stamp pad and lifted, expecting ink to stay with the felt. But the pad came up dry, and the ink clung to the rubber stamp like something that had made up its mind to hold. Evelyn came in a little later than usual, walking in the way she did when she had brought the day to heal before it had a chance to scatter. She hung her jacket with a crisp motion and stood, hands on the desk, eyelids tight. Her palms lay down their own pale damp, fainter than Nora's, and careful not to trespass over the print that was already there. She spoke of the county note, how it wanted reports that proved the building was being looked after, how it wanted the downstairs closed for a stretch until someone had time to look at the old pipes that had never actually misbehaved. They had only sounded like they might. She spoke without complaint and without hope. "Keep the desk tidy," she said, which was how she asked Nora to keep herself in a shape the day could use. People are easier when the place looks ready. It did look ready in that odd way the building had begun to perfect. The lids straight on the pens, the paper clips nested, the call slips in a stack without ragged corners, the book truck at the right angle, pointed nose toward the aisles. The air pressed down with its soft hand. The walkie on its charger crackled and fell quiet, like an old stove deciding against a cough. Patrons came in with the weather stitched into them. A woman brought a bag of picture books and tipped them gently onto the desk, standing to watch them as if they might complain. They left a neat round of wet for each cover. A young man who had been coming in most afternoons for the study room hovered and did not ask for it. He stood near the fish tank and watched the guppies break the surface in a rhythm that looked like thought. The man with the thick neck asked for a local history with photographs, found it by himself, and took it to a corner where he turned the pages with a care that surprised Nora. When he returned it, he kept a hand on the cover a long time, as if to make sure it would stay put. The blotter said little. It held its old faint rings like a recipe card soaked and dried, and never the same again. The handprint did not count as a ring. It was its own quiet fact. When Nora stood in it, her body found a small ease, the way you do when you step into your own tracks in a patch of snow. She tried not to linger there while people watched. She stepped off to the side to clear a cough or sinus slip and felt her joints argue for just a second. She ignored them, and the feeling passed, like a headache that chooses to wait. Mid-morning brought a clutch of school children and their teacher. The class lined up in a narrow snake, and the children pressed their mouths to their hands to trap the whispers they were not supposed to have. Nora watched the line sway and felt her nerves grow a thin pelt against noise. The teacher signed the list for the meeting room and apologized for the energy. The apology did not lift the energy, it polished it. The children lumbered past with the careful drama of small people acting at being big. One boy dragged his palm along the wall and looked at the streak it made with a satisfied solemnity that made Nora want to laugh and then not. The class stayed long enough to shed a small rain of paper feathers and pencil curls. After they left, the reading room held a long, warm breath, then let it out. Nora swept gently and listened to the scrape of grit across wood. The scraping sounded like the tail of a thought. On her way back to the desk, she noticed a new mark on the staff board in the hall, a watermark that held the oval suggestion she'd seen before, but clearer. This one had an additional haze, right where a nose might be. She did not touch it. She kept moving, adding motion as a kind of prayer. The county man came with another case, this one slimmer, this one opening to a probe that looked more like a kitchen tool than an instrument. He spoke to Evelyn in a voice that tried to make the problem narrow. He tapped a reading and frowned as if he had been trapped by arithmetic. He asked to see the basement again. He had the solemn look of a person who tells his own day that everything is ordinary and who is angry when that is not quite possible. Nora led him down. The air at the bottom step touched the back of her hand like a cat that had decided to try affection. The man gestured toward the unplugged machine and said technical words that tried to cut a neat hole around what they could not absorb. "It's holding water," he said, which anyone could see. The little window shone with its thin line like a child insisting it was taller than yesterday. "It shouldn't be holding more." "Maybe it isn't," Nora said. He glanced at her without moving his head. "Maybe my eyes are wrong," he said, a joke that had no appetite for laughter. He signed another form. He asked for the logs Evelyn kept. He went away. When she came up the steps again, Nora paused at the bend and held still the way you do when you think you might catch a sound that is about to become a word. She did not hear speech. She heard a small elastic creak, like a book jacket bending to accommodate a spine that had grown a hair. She put her hand on the wall where the board hung and felt only cool paint. The oval mark glimmered in the light that did not have to try very hard to be tired. At lunch, she warmed soup in the staff room and left the lid on too long. The steam blew out at the sides of the container with a sound like fine gravel poured into a bucket. She sat at the break table and listened to water rattle in the sink, while a thin stream fell from a faucet that seemed to have lost track of shut and open. She ate with the slow care of a person who does not want to insult time by rushing through it. Her phone lay face down. She had no appetite to read the town notice about basement checks one more time. The overhead bulb in the staff room had a ring of dark at its base that looked like an eclipse got tired halfway through. When she returned to the desk, a teenager stood with a wrung look and his chin pressed down, hiding his mouth behind the ridge of his hoodie. He set a book on the desk that had been checked out to him weeks ago. He didn't say anything. He tilted the book S-cover and worried a corner of it as if trying to rub it clean. A circle spread around the book where it touched the blotter, a true ring, darker than most, patient as old water. Nora reached to lift the book, and the boy put his hand on it, soft, not stopping her, only delaying the lift for a heartbeat. She felt a pull then, not toward the back, not toward the cold aisle between biographies and gardening, but toward the space just behind her knees, the spot where she rested before she slid into the handprint to stand and say hello. "Do you want to keep it longer?" she asked, and heard her own voice as if it traveled through cloth. He took his hand back and shook his head. He looked toward the fish tank. He looked toward the door. Then he turned and left without another word. The ring under the book stayed as if to keep his place in an unseen line. It lightened when she aligned the book with the others on the truck. She watched it go and felt that quiet gratitude again, like someone telling her she had put something right that had been sliding. Afternoon made a low ceiling over the town. The hardware store sent a message to say the aisle with pipe and glue would stay roped for a while. The post office ran its fans. The bakery across the street propped both doors and left a wooden wedge to keep them from arguing with each other. The road crew scraped black from their shovels against the truck bed with a series of sharp taps that sounded like a moral lesson delivered with too much patience. Inside the library, the aisles held their own weather. The cold place by the far window spread by a width you could not swear to with the naked eye, only with your skin. Nora leaned into it and then stepped away, as if from a draft at a half-shut door. Toward late afternoon, the volunteer nurse came in, bloused with heat, hair up, pencil tucked behind the ear that always had room for it. She took the returns cart like a favored chore and set off at a glide that made no sound at all. Nora listened for the small click of books finding their seats. The click did not come. A long moment later there came a different sound, the kind you hear from the next room when a glass has been set on a coaster with too much care. Then another. Then nothing. Nora stepped into the aisles and called the nurse, named the way you summon someone without wishing to startle them. She turned the easy corner past gardening and felt the cool air lay itself along her cheek like a resume. The nurse stood 3 paces ahead, her hand resting against a shelf, her eyes big, as if she had just been told a story and was deciding how much of it to keep. The cart sat nearby, front wheel rolled slightly to one side as if listening. "Do you feel that?" the nurse asked, and her voice was respectful of something in the air that did not care to be named. Nora came next to her and placed her own palm in the same place. The stillness climbed through her hand and into the bone above her wrist. It was a stillness you could choose if you were very tired. It offered itself like a chair pulled back from a table. Nora took her hand away. "We'll do downstairs tomorrow," she said, and they pushed the cart together as if it had grown heavier for a moment and then remembered how to roll. On the way back to the desk, Nora saw a child's drawing pinned sideways on the community board, an ocean of blue crayon with a shape in it that might have been a fish or might have been a word someone had tried to write too fast and given up. The tack used to pin it had a tiny red bloom at the edge, as if water had dissolved iron where it met the paper. Evening fell without drama, as if encouraged to be polite. The last patrons left reluctantly and washed themselves out the door on a tide of thanks. Nora watched the light go stale and then thin. She did the end-of-day things. She ran the counts with a pencil because the day did not want to hear the plastic chatter of the little calculator. She emptied the printer bin and pushed the sheets into a stack with the heel of her hand. She turned the sign on the door. She stood in her place and laid her palm in the handprint because that was what the desk wanted. She had started a habit of one more walk after the lights were meant to go out. She told herself she was checking that no one had been left to doze in a chair or that the bathroom did not want attention. The habit became the night's way of making a decision. If the cool air by the far window had advanced even a little, she would stand in it until she could not tell whether it had been cold all along. If a gap waited where one had not been earlier, she would not fill it unless a book had told her to, by ring or by memory. The gaps had stopped being surprises. They had become more like breaths you could predict if you knew the person standing beside you. There was a gap that night, back in reference, a slender throat between atlases, the inner edges glistening as if someone had just wetted them with a cloth. She put a fingertip to it and felt the stillness like a promise. She tasted metal in the back of her mouth. She let the finger rest there until the joint felt stiff and then pulled it back and wiped it absent-mindedly against her jeans. When she stood still a long time, the silence made shapes around her, and one of those shapes felt closely echoing, like another person standing 3 strides away and matching her breath. She did not turn to look. She did not make room in her picture of the room for anyone else. She walked away, and the gap closed on its own with a private satisfaction she could feel in her shoulder blades. At home, the air tried her. The upstairs room she rented had always held on to heat a bit longer than it should. Now it held on to damp, and the overnight trickle of traffic on the trucking road rasped whatever had begun to grow in the corner behind her lamp. The kitchen sink developed a ring where a clean glass had sat too long. On the small table by the window, she found in the morning a pale map left by a bowl that had sweat in the humid night. The shape of the map looked like the Isles. She stood over it and knew the route it showed. High, then left, then the far run where the carpet went cold. She wiped the tabletop with a rough cloth and felt the wood take the wipe into itself as if she had rubbed a salve into a knee. She said out loud that she would not be bossed by furniture. Sleep grew thin. She dreamed the staff hall without its bend. In the dream, the hall went on, and the walls held dozens of boards, each with a listing of names and contact numbers and advisories that repeated until they lost meaning. The oval stain on the board smeared into another and another until there were faces, not crisp ones, not portraits, only a suggestion of a gaze that had chosen not to be sharp. She woke with the feeling of having been arranged again, as if her bones had been placed inside her skin by someone trying very hard to be kind. The county sent another notice. Doors were to be propped open whenever possible. Fans were to be borrowed if needed. All basements were to be kept shut to the public. Any unusual condensation was to be noted and reported in the afternoon. The notice used the word unusual, and then again, as if saying it twice might make it a measurement. Evelyn posted it next to the first and put a small strip of tape at the corner that would not lie flat. The strip curled up anyway and showed its sticky inside to the air like a wound. The town learned to open its windows, even when it was not pleasant to do so. The bakery pulled its front doors wide and watched napkins lift. The dry cleaner ran a humming chorus of machines, but propped the back door to let out whatever would not be folded into starch. The hardware store sold out of dehumidifiers and told people theirs would do no better than a bowl left in a corner for the sake of a good feeling. The river did not rise. It sat, as always, shouldering the town like a quiet cousin, throwing off a smell of coins now and then when it wanted to be remembered. In the library, the volunteer nurse began to wear a cardigan even when it was not needed. She said she felt the cold in ways she could not measure, and she smiled while she said it, as if to ease the edges of a confession. The nurse wrote in the log about a drip that came and went from behind the old cabinet downstairs. The drip made a noise like a last swallow from a bottle set on its side. She wrote about a puddle that had developed under the waver in the extension cord, then dried when no one had watched it. She left a small hash mark for every time the copier asked for paper, and then decided it did not want any after all. The hash marks made a ring no one acknowledged. Nora's body began to assign its own ticks to the building's ticks. Her left shoulder blunted at the end of the day, as if she had been carrying weight. The pad under her thumb grew smooth, not from stamps, but from resting too often on paper. Dryness fled her skin and then returned without reason. When she stood in the handprint, her breathing matched the hush that rose from the carpet like steam from a sink of hot water. She spent a few minutes each hour standing one pace away from the place where the print lay, just to prove that her lungs were still tuned by something other than the blotter. Those minutes felt like standing in a doorway waiting on a visitor who had promised to be late. The next map was not a map at all. It was a single circle that refused to announce itself as anyone's drink, anyone's sleeve, anyone's book. It formed at mid-afternoon while the place held its quiet and the sun tried to visit through the high windows. The circle appeared on the desk exactly where a patron would set a cup, which no one was allowed. It darkened and stayed. It did not swell outward. It did not sink away. It sat and waited. The waiting felt like attention returned. Nora set her palm beside it. The two shapes looked like the hands of a person at rest. She did not place her hand over it. She did not want to match it yet. She did not trust what would come if she did. She sat on the tall stool and watched the light shift and listened to the walkie let out a little sigh as static found a new home in a corner. It preferred. The bell refused to ring. It gave a dull thud under her fingers, like a heartbeat you can hear because you have pressed an ear to a chest. She did not press again. Patrons notice things in the way people notice anything that tries to catch them without being rude about it. A woman told Nora the barcode scanner sounded sweeter in the morning than in the evening. An older man asked if there had always been a cool place by the far windows or if he had just grown the kind of bones that complained. A girl pointed at the fish and asked if they slept. When Nora said she imagined they did, the girl said that fish did not have eyelids, and so you had to teach them rest by covering their tank. She held out a paper square for the tank and then took it back, embarrassed by her own generosity to a fish. Nora took notice of a boy who had begun to come in toward close and stand as if looking for a mother who had gone to get the car. He had a haircut that looked like someone jarred had gotten bored halfway through. He didn't ask for a room or a book. He watched the aisles. He watched Nora move. The second evening she saw him, he put his hand on the desk and left a damp oval as familiar as a handshake. He removed it and traced the outline with a fingertip as if measuring something men sometimes measure without thinking. He seemed pleased by what he saw. Then he left. When the oval faded, it did so in segments, like puddles do when they are being drunk by sponge and air. In the morning, when she came back, she found a faint echo of it, as if the desk had not let the last of it go. She began to catch herself pausing at thresholds, not just in the building, but everywhere. The grocery store held damp at the cold case that was normal, but the ring her basket left on the conveyor at checkout felt too deliberate to be chalked up to cold lettuce and a hand on a thawed bag of peas. The laundromat at the end of her street gave off a clean, wet heat that had always been there, but between the cycles there was a brief inhalation that pulled at her shirt. The gas station, where she bought a cheap coffee whenever she drove to see her father, had puddled under the air pump and left a mark on the concrete that reminded her of the gap between reference and gardening. She told herself this was how attention worked. Once you heard the world speak in a new tense, you heard it everywhere. The day regret walked in wore a brown jacket and did not look like regret until it was halfway done being itself. The woman with the jacket set her palms on the desk and asked for a book she had loved when she was young. She could not remember its title. It had a patchwork cover, she said, and a girl who moved from place to place. Nora asked if she meant one book, and the woman said she did. She knew that if she saw it, she would know. Nora stood and reminded her knees that they could choose not to creak. She walked into the aisles and followed a feeling that had less to do with alphabetical logic than with the thin wash of cool air that sometimes traced itself over the backs of her fingers. She turned where she should not have and paused where there was no reason to pause, and stood in a place that smelled like the corners of a cardboard box that had been stored where no one opened it often. She slid out a book with a cover that looked like a table runner and brought it back. The woman set her hand on it and began to cry without any sound at all. She did not cry a lot. She cried like the top of a salt shaker sees use. She stopped and smoothed her face. She said thank you and held the book like she held a child who has learned to stand. She left. When Nora looked down, the blotter showed two pale ovals where the woman's hands had been, and above them, faint and timid, the suggestion of another circle, wider, like the ghost of a body at a distance. Nora placed her palm in her print, and it fit more neatly than it had before. When she lifted it away, the paper did not lighten. It held the shape and seemed to be waiting for something more. On a day that began bright and then retreated, the library lost power for a short time. The fans fell silent, and the copier S screen went black, and the fish tank bubbler stopped its work and left the surface to hold its peace. For a few minutes, the only sound was the far rumble of trucks on the road and the soft fray of voices carried from the street by the open door. The pause felt righteous and old, like a game the town used to play and had forgotten how to make fun. Evelyn stood by the desk and counted in her head with her jaw set. The lights came back on all at once, and the copier woke like a horse shaking flies off its flank. The fish tank bubbler hesitated, then resumed with a grumpy blurp. Everything had chosen to continue. There was relief in it, and the relief felt borrowed as if it had been bought on credit. The outage left a ring under the bell as clean as a coin pulled from a pocket. Nora lifted the bell and shook a single drop out of its lip and watched it fall and flatten itself into the blotter. The drop did not run. It stayed modest. She pressed her palm beside it and told herself, not for the first time, that she could choose a different geometry for this room. She could keep herself from fitting too well into the space the building had begun to make. She could remain a person who left the room each evening and returned the next morning bearing coffee and a pocket full of keys and a face with a small salt in it and a set of motions that you learn when you have worked a job long enough to make a path in the carpet. The choice turned itself into a task. The task was to move a little less like someone who had been shelved. She made herself cross the room in a new line now and then. She stood on the side of the desk she had never stood on, except to tape a notice. She listened to the walkie and did not pick it up when it cracked its thin speech. She went downstairs one afternoon with the volunteer nurse and a tape measure and did a modest, goofy inventory of boxes, not to measure anything that needed measuring, only to put numbers in the room the way a person puts prayer in a room that will not be satisfied by jokes. The unplugged unit in the basement, taller than a person's shoulder and as blank as a refrigerator, had gathered a shade of water past the line Nora remembered. She stood and did not remark on it. The nurse did what nurses do and remarked gently on Nora instead. "You look tired around the mouth," she said. "Drink more water." "Everything in this town is already water," Nora said, nearly smiling. She felt the silliness wash her voice and then drain from it. "I'm fine." They stood in the concrete room and listened to the quiet do its small chores. Somewhere behind the cabinets, there was the noise of a drip preceded by a thin intake. The thin intake sounded like a person preparing to say a hard thing and then deciding against it. The nurse flattened her hand against the coolness of the nearest stack and closed her eyes for a moment. "I don't like that I like it," she said softly. "It feels like being told to sit and liking that someone has given you a chair." They went back up with an armload of old pamphlets about town councils and some affairs no one attended anymore. On the staff board in the hall, the oval mark had darkened into the suggestion of a face that you could not describe to a sketch artist. There was a nested halo of paler damp inside it, as if the board were learning how to layer a likeness. Evelyn paused and considered it, and then took a cloth and wiped the board hard. The damp held a second, then went. She pinned a new notice over that spot and smoothed the corners as if making a bed. The next afternoon, heavy air lay on the building like a folded towel on a shoulder. No one came in for a long run. The handprint on the blotter deepened until its edges looked cut with a blade. Nora stood and avoided it, and then stood in it, tired of her own argument. When she stood there, She could count the small clicks in the ceiling and link them to the distant hiss of tires on the road, and tie in the faint flit of fish fins and hear the way the code reader tuned itself with its own breath at the top of each scan. The building sounds arranged themselves into something like a chord. She was not certain what the chord wanted from her. It wanted attention at the very least. It wanted her body to be an instrument that could make its call finish its shape. The boy with the haircut came in and stopped, as if waiting permission to cross from warm day to colder interior. He looked at the desk and at the handprint. He walked back toward reference without signing anything, the way people did in this town when they wanted to keep themselves off of paper. Nora let him go and waited to hear him moving a chair or placing his shoes in a way that would admit him to someone else's idea of silence. She heard nothing. She held still and did not raise the walkie. She waited the way you wait when you know that anything you do will be the wrong sort of motion. At last, the smallest scrape arrived, like a fingernail dragged lightly across a desktop. Then a sound like a book's spine settling into place. Then nothing. Nora stood. Her legs had taken on the mild ache of a person who has rehearsed standing 100 times in a day. She walked into the aisles and found the young man there, one hand on a shelf, looking at the blank sliver between two big atlases, as if that sliver were a window onto some water he recognized. His eyes were calm. He set his fingers in the gap and then took them away and left drops where they had been, spaced as if counted. "Looking for something?" she asked. "Just here," he said, and that was all. He moved a shoulder as if to make room for her, and then did not. She stood and felt the air connect their skin the way static finds an arm hair to lift. She wanted to say that certain spaces are not to be leaned into. She wanted to ask whether he felt anything particular at the back of his neck. She did not. She turned and left the aisle as if she had checked what she meant to check and had found it not worth remarking on. The walk back to the desk seemed longer than the walk up the aisle. It had a length you feel when you get up from a seat you love and say you will go now and then find you have not moved. There are days a job does not allow your own thoughts to form, and you are grateful to be relieved of them. There are other days work feeds your thoughts until they are almost kind enough to hold. Nora had both kinds. The building pushed on her thoughts with its damp and its cooling places and its gaps. She did not resist. She did not invite. She did what people do who have learned a decent patience. She kept a log that said little and watched the shelves for the way they leaned toward one another in the last hour, before closed away papers warped just enough at the corners to look like breaths had sat on them, and then walked away. Her father called, and she let his voice fill the staff room while she drank water that tasted faintly of the copper coil in the sink heater. He asked about her car and said he'd changed the belts on his own. He asked if she was eating and then apologized for asking. He told a story about a barn roof that had buckled in a long wet and how it made odd music while it thought about falling. He did not ask her about her dampness because he could not see it. After she hung up, she stood with her hand on the cool metal of the cabinet that held pencils and paper and outdated forms, and held still until the place where her hand met the metal felt like a location on a map of the room. The evening that arrived like a decision did not begin differently enough to warn her. The door opened and closed. People came in and left with the weight of borrowed things in their hands. The volunteer nurse put away a book that had lived on the cart too long and nodded once, almost a bow, as if acknowledging the part of Nora that had learned to guide without grasping. The copier made a sound of satisfaction that was nothing to do with paper. The fish tank bubbled in the old sane way of a machine that believes in every day being the same. Then the handprint on the blotter altered. It deepened at the base of the palm, as if the hand had pressed harder there. The very center of it shone, as if a drop had found the old mark and revived it. Next to it, the circle that came with no cup or sleeve grew too. Next to it, the circle that came with no cup or sleeve grew too. The two shapes began to connect at one thin point, a narrow bridge of damp that looked like a vein finding its path. Nora put her own hand down to claim the print and felt the coolness meet her like the back of a spoon placed against fever. The sense that rose in her chest was not panic. It was relief, shaped into something like a seat being pulled back from a table. She lifted her hand and walked toward Reference, knowing Reference would be there waiting in its old way, and that the gap would open in the new way, and that the two truths would meet in the space where she stood. She could feel the aisle measuring her as she came, the carpet loops making their small forgiveness noises under her weight, the fluorescence buzzing like an insect that has learned the geometry of its cage. She reached the tall books and looked down. The damp edges gleamed. The atlas spines leaned fine and then corrected themselves as if noting a guest with a quiet confidence. Somewhere behind her, Evelyn's shoes made a sound on linoleum. The volunteer nurse's laugh in the staff room came to its end and softened into conversation that would not be remembered. The walkie whispered and then hushed. The building drew its breath and held it. The gap waited with the stillness that had flowed into her before, the stillness of paper that has chosen its climate. She stood in that climate and felt her ribs arrange themselves the way books do when they nestle and then stand true in a row that will not slouch. She had the odd sensation that if she set her hand inside the gap, the skin would accept it without asking for sweat or heat. She set her hand inside. The air in the gap was neither cold nor warm. It felt like the underside of a wooden table that has been polished by knees and stories. The stillness climbed to her elbow. It stopped there, as if it had been taught manners. A warmth came to her eyes that was not tears, only a small expansion, as if the world had been drawn too tight over her and was now looser by a hair. "Find something," Evelyn asked from the end of the aisle, and her voice carried the good humor a person produces for others, so no one will think they are worried. Nora kept her hand where it was. "Putting something back," she said, and that was true. She slid her other hand along the shelf and felt the slickness left by the air, the neat beading along the edges of covers. That sensation had always made her think of leaves after mist. Now it made her think of skin after a bath in a house that kept warm water like a saved thing. She took her hand from the gap and stood without moving. The room felt like it was waiting for the word that would send everyone to their assigned places. She could have stepped away. She could have walked back to the desk and stood in the handprint and let the evening fold up like a letter from a person you do not want to answer. She could have gone home to her upstairs place and opened the window and listened to brakes whine and told the corner behind the lamp that it had not earned the right to bloom. She could have made soup and pressed the lid down and watched steam shake itself into a dance. She could have called her father and listened to his breath. She did not do any of that. She stood there at the mouth of Reference and pressed her palm flat against the back of one atlas, as if to hold it still, as if it might buck. Then she stepped forward until her ribs were under the shelf, quiet, and her shoulder touched the wood, and the chill that was not chill climbed into her. She breathed in. The gap did not widen. It did not have to. It was enough that it held. She closed her eyes to let a hard thinking pass like a tide. She waited to be afraid. Fear did not oblige. Another feeling came up in her, lower to the ground, less obvious. It was the feeling you get when you have left work and realize that the day has been working on you all along, arranging you to fit its own end. She did not say yes to anything. She did not say no. She stood and let the minute lift and lower her like water in a very narrow place. The library arranged itself around her the way a careful hand arranges a bouquet. She felt ridiculous thinking that word, so she allowed a less pretty one. The building stacked itself around her. That was better. That was closer to how a person like her thinks. A kind of fatigue carried her up. That fatigue was not simple. It braided together the endless attention she had been paying to rings and coolness and small clicks, and the work of making herself seem unremarkable. In that braid was the damp dislike of being alone too long while wanting to be left alone. In that braid was the satisfaction of a thing filing clean into the space it had claimed. She let the braid be a rope, and she held it, and then she did not. Nora pulled her hand from the gap. She stepped back. The stillness left her arm with obedience, but not with reluctance. It hung a moment, and then returned to its own place, which was where the air fit the wood and the paper fit their season. She turned and walked the aisle toward the desk with the deliberate speed of someone who has agreed to carry a fragile thing that cannot afford to be fussed with. She reached the desk and stood on the place that had learned her. The handprint fit like the inside of a glove after the leather has known its wearer a long time. She set both hands down now, palms flat, and felt a larger stillness travel from the paper into her. Evelyn watched her from the other side, with her mouth arranged into belief. The volunteer nurse came to the end of the staff hall and looked toward the desk as if drawn by a wire. The walkie let out a burst of speech that turned into nonsense, and then into a dial tone, and then into nothing. The fish tank bubbled as if to give the room permission to continue. Nora stood like that a long moment, and then another and another, until the line between moments blurred, and she could not tell which piece of time she was standing in. The blotter lightened under her hands and then darkened and then lightened again as if trying to send a message to its own paper. She lifted one hand and the shape stayed, full as before. She lifted the other and now there were two prints, and the thin bridge between them had become a pair of pale veins. She reached to the shelf by the desk where the old ledger lived and pulled it down without a thought. The book fell open to a page where someone who worked here in a faraway year had written a sentence about a shipment that had arrived with its covers warped and a faint smell of the river. The ink had faded to the color of tea left too long on a porch. The sentence ended with a word followed by a tiny blot, as if the pen had touched more moisture than it could hold. She wrote her own sentence beneath it without thinking about what it would mean. Her hand drifted into print that looked a little like the old hand and a little like hers. She wrote that the air had learned her name. The ink bled into the fibers of the page with a calm that made her ashamed of herself for wanting to be known by a room. The evening brought a young mother carrying a sleeping child across her shoulder. She needed a bathroom, and then she needed a catalog check, and then she needed to leave quickly, because the child had learned to wake angry and would not forget what he had learned today. Nora moved the necessary pieces for her without moving from the handprint. She kept one palm on the paper and one hand free for the barcode and the return slip and the pen. The woman said thank you in a voice that had gravel in it from too many exhausted mornings. Nora said of course, and meant it as a motion rather than a phrase. By the time the woman left, the blotter had deepened again under her hand, dark as a winter pond. Another customer came and asked about obituaries, of a woman no one had known but her family loved. Nora directed him to the microfilm, and he nodded and walked away. Already part of that dim river of people who know what they need and prefer to fetch it themselves. She listened for the spool and heard it fuss, and then behave. She listened for the bell and did not press it. She listened for the fish and heard the small slap that means a mouth has broken surface and fallen back without fuss. She smelled crayons and a ghost of coffee and the metal of a coin that had been bitten. Night nearly arrived and then changed its mind and waited a little longer outside. The room settled into the last act of its habit. The rugs held still. The staging of chairs and tables sat as perfect as a show that has learned its audience. Nora kept her hand in the print and felt the building notice that she had chosen. She felt the nearby shelf notice. She felt the aisles take her into their measurement. The word for what happened then was not peace, People always want peace from buildings that hold words. The word was placement. The room placed her. She did not resist. Resistance would have broken something. She let the room finish setting her in the spot it had made. The sound of the road outside pulled its anchor and drifted off. The walkie gave one more nonsense mutter and then slept. The nurse retrieved her cardigan from the back of a chair and stood looking as if waiting for the right weather to leave into. Evelyn checked locks she had checked 1,000 times, and then, for once, did not tell Nora to go home. She watched the desk in the way a person watches a creek across a fence, held by the water but pretending to judge a post. "You're all right," she said, and there was not much question in it. "I'm in the right place," Nora said, which was not an answer. The two women did not move for long breaths. The nurse went to the door and turned the sign and came back. The building breathed as if refusing to take sides. At last, the hand Nora had kept free to do the motions of the desk felt heavy. She laid it down flat beside the other and let both hands claim their damp. The paper received her. The desk did not complain. The thin veins between her prints widened into a sheen that looked like slit mica. Her shoulders settled, and she felt her spine clean itself of stiffness, like someone drawing a blade through stiff dough. She stayed as the last light loosened its hold and the fluorescents kept their small, tireless buzz. She stayed, and the staff did what they were meant to do when a person says they are staying. They accepted it. The volunteer nurse stood beside her for a time and then touched the rim of the bell and did not ring it and left. Evelyn walked the main aisle and checked the windows and then took a slow tour through reference without looking at the gap. She paused at the atlases and breathed. When she came back, she set a hand on the desk, not touching Nora's hand, but close enough for her knuckles to feel a small giving in the air. "Tomorrow," Evelyn said, which meant she would be here. "Tomorrow," Nora said, which meant she would too. They left her in the room the way you would leave a lamp turned low. The building settled its small shoulders. The fish made their laps. The copier slept with a light that pretended it was an eye. The fans throbbed softly in the places they had been set, and the open windows let in a dark that had summer's thickness in it, without summer's promise. The road wore down to a whisper that asked nothing. Nora stood at the desk and felt the floor climb half a hair to meet her. The floor holds everyone, but it had begun to learn to hold her by preference. She watched the doorway, as if someone were about to come with a question. No one came. Night inside a library is not silence, it is reluctance. Words in covers do not want to be still, they want to lean and suggest. The room made that whispering sound now, the old paper being breathed by the air. In the staff hall, the board lifted a faint oval again through the new notice. At the bend of the stairs, the cool place gathered itself like a cat in a doorway. Downstairs, behind the cabinets, a drip rearranged its idea of patience. The handprints on the blotter did not dry. They kept the darkness of water pulled a long time ago from air and held for occasions like this. Nora adjusted her weight, which the desk accepted without complaint. At one point, she lifted one hand and then placed it back down again, the way a person in sleep tests the bed and then trusts it. She thought of her father and then let the thought go without sadness, as if she could lend herself to this and still have a voice down the phone line next week. She thought of the boy who had placed his fingers in the gap and left dots counted out by his heart, and hoped he would put his hands to metal and work for a thing instead of giving himself to the shelf that held nothing yet but wanted very much to. Toward the dark center, a sound came from reference, a soft chock of a heavy book tucked home. It might have been the room settling its breath. It might have been a spine remembering how to be straight. Nora did not look around the side of her monitor to see. The room allowed her not to look. She had the feeling you have when you stand in a coat you have owned a long time and feel the old weight of a set of keys in the pocket. and know that you could take them out, or you could leave them, and either would be right in a way that does not require you to choose forever. When the small hours turned their quiet corners, the door latch stirred. Evelyn's key did its tidy work. Morning slid in under the heels of someone who has learned to get the building to obey. The first light was not generous, and the fluorescence hummed with the eagerness of machines who think they are the only ones doing a job. The smell of coffee came like a promise kept in good faith and not mentioned again. The air was wet in a way that had stopped being an event. The desk held its prints. Nora lifted her hands and looked down. The marks had changed while she stood. Their shape had broadened, and the bridge between them had deepened to a pale bar. The bar had letters in it almost. Not letters, the suggestion of lines ready to be read. She did not tilt the paper to try to make the lines fall into legible shapes. She had learned not to chase the room's language with a human mouth. She let the marks lie as they chose. Evelyn set down a stack of holds and did not look at the blotter. She looked at Nora's face and read it. "Go wash," she said gently, which was how she told someone she was glad they were here. Nora did as told. The bathroom behind the desk had a mirror that was not honest or cruel, only old. Someone had left a line of soap in the dish that looked like a horizon. The air in the small room held itself taut as a towel wrung and hung to dry. She washed her hands and watched the water run off her skin in beads rather than sheets, as if she had grown a layer against being wetted. She dried them on the rough brown towel that always smelled faintly of the room where it waited to be useful. When she came out, a man stood at the desk with a hat in his hand that he had not removed. He asked for an obituary of his brother. He did not say dead. He did not say the river. He did not say where. Nora pointed him toward the prefab station the county had built to give weight to the process of searching microfilm. The man nodded and went. He walked with a long hip swing that people kept for hard work. His shoes left nothing on the carpet but courtesy. At mid-morning, the volunteer nurse handed Nora a folded scrap with a number on it and a name that was hers. "In case you need someone after hours," she said, which meant, do not give yourself to the things you cannot measure without someone to tell you a story about a bird or a ruined roof first. Nora tucked the scrap in her pocket, and it turned soft from her palm, damp, and her normal habit of checking it was there. She knew she would likely never call. The number did its work anyway. There was weather the color of dishwater a little while, and the bakery closed one door and pretended it had meant to. The hardware store got in boxes of something, and men came and went carrying them in both arms as if they were sick children trusting you not to drop them. The road crew thumped their shovels against their boots. From the river a smell lifted, the smell of old coins and distant metal that never gives up entirely. In the library, those shapes were familiar. They did not announce a change, only a holding. The day did bring one thing new. A sheet of heavy paper arrived in the mail addressed in a tidy hand to the head librarian. Evelyn opened it at the desk and then turned it around for Nora to see. It was an old photograph, printed from a negative someone had kept in a collar box or in a sleeve among recipes. The picture showed the reference aisles before the carpet had gone in, wood darker, shelves lower. Two women stood at the immediate end of the aisle. One held a book against her chest like armor. The other had one hand set against the shelf with her wrist square. The prints on the paper had been blurred by time. Still, there was a delicacy to the edges of those hands that made the photograph feel wet. Behind the women, the aisle ran back until it met a darker square that might have been a door or a shadow. The space between the spines near that square held a sheen, as if the emulsion had remembered someone breathing there. The letter with the photograph was a few polite sentences about a donation and memory, and an invitation to a reunion, if such a reunion should ever be desired. Evelyn put the picture in a clear sleeve and propped it in the little plastic stand the friends had bought to make the desk look like news. The two women stared a little past the camera, as if the person taking the picture had asked them to think of a future task instead of the act of being captured. Nora stood and looked at their hands and thought, someone else had their palm against that shelf before I did. Someone else felt the same stillness and let it climb to the elbow and stop there. Someone else was placed and did not protest. The handprints on the blotter did not ask. They kept their patient wet like a promise for which there is no exact word. They dried at the edges where fingers end and deepened where a hand holds weight. People came and returned and came. A man in coveralls borrowed the code and put it back. A girl in a sweater 2 sizes too big for her age returned a book with loose pages and apologized with the fine voice she had kept for a grandmother. The fish tank bubbled. The walkie breathed a complaint and then settled down. Late afternoon found Nora and Evelyn together at the desk. The nurse had gone to collect a prescription. The door stood propped with the wedge. The day's heat leaned in and did not choose to cross the threshold. The cool place by the far windows lengthened by the measure of a shrug. The gap in reference opened as if called and stayed open as if waiting. Nora saw it from here without turning her head. She felt it like a coin under the sole of a shoe. She did not move to it. She stood in the print. Her shoulders dropped and her hands lay flat and heavy as soap on the paper. "You can go," she said at last to Evelyn, who had not asked. "I'll close." Evelyn nodded as if this had been agreed long ago, and they were both now living out the end of a bargain made between them without words. She collected her things and put her jacket on her arm rather than around her shoulders. At the door, she paused and turned. She looked at the board in the staff hall and then did not look at it. She looked at Nora and then did not look at her hands. "Lock for the night," she said, and left. The minute after she was gone, folded itself like a blanket pulled up. Nora breathed. Then she did the night walk and found the aisles breathing as well. The gaps had multiplied. Not many. Not a rash. Only enough to make her own arms want to settle at her sides and her chin want to lower. One opened where the municipal code had gone in a few evenings back. Another bloomed for the length of a breath at the end of the biographies and then closed like a polite mouth when she put her hand near it to say not today. The air in the building made the stand of the hair on her skin into a map any bird would have recognized as thermal. She made her choice. It was not a speech. It was not even a thought with clear words in it. It was motion. She turned from the aisles and walked back to the desk at her natural speed, which had always been a steady pace, like someone pushing a grocery cart without a list, but with a plan. She stood on her place. She set both hands as the paper wanted. She took the end of day keys. She turned the lock on the front door. She turned the lock on the side door. She turned the lock on the staff hall door and left it. She shut down the screen in the time-worn way and watched it flicker and go black and drink its reflection. She straightened the pencils. She folded the returns sheet. She placed the little clear stand with the old photograph so the women's hands could see her hands. Then she let the floor bring her another hair closer to the center it had set for her. She stood while the dark completed its decision and found its places against the windows and in the corners and under the big table where children colored. The building laid damp along her wrists like cuffs made of fog. The bell rested under a small meniscus that did not slip. The blotter AS handprints became dark lakes where a person could imagine fishing and bringing nothing up but a sweet ache in the shoulders. Reference made it small throat sounds. Downstairs, the drip took up a timekeeper S role and kept it until quiet had been divided into sections and set in order. At some point, a small weight touched the hand nearest the bell. Not the weight of a person or a book. The weight of a slip of paper, perhaps, or of the oldest kind of dust. She did not look down. She knew the feel of a call slip when it had been cut from a pad. She kept her eyes on the dark window that had begun to keep back her reflection, as if it wanted to see the inside instead. The weight remained. She let it remain. She slept or did something like it, upright and in place, not sagging, not straining. The sleep had no dream. The sleep was the body pausing between shelvings. In the pale that comes before the world believes itself again, the door latch breathed, and Evelyn's key performed the service for which keys were made. The lights woke. The fan in the staff room coughed and then spun. The smell of coffee returned, like a story told out of habit and still meaning something. Nora lifted her hand. The slip lifted with it, stuck dark to her palm for a moment, and then falling to the blotter as if returning to its shore. She turned it over. Her name had been written on it in the tidy hand used for all slips here. Below it, where the shelf mark would go, someone had written a direction that could be read as staff hall or reference, depending on how you read the first curve. She smiled, though it was not a smile anyone would have called happy. She slid the slip under the lip of the monitor and left it there to anchor the day. The board in the staff hall had dried in the night. Its oval had nearly gone. The edges still showed if you stood to the side and let the light be kind to secrets. Evelyn noticed and permitted herself a small, nearly invisible loosening between eyebrows. She touched the board as she passed and then pressed her fingertips together as if to wipe away a smudge of chalk no one could see. Work repeated itself as always and as itself. The volunteer nurse arrived with a cardigan folded over her arm, despite the bossy heat. The boy with the haircut came in, stood at the border between warm and cool, as if taking instructions, and then left without entering, like someone called home by a whistle you cannot hear. The man in coveralls returned the municipal code and looked startled to find that a clean mark had appeared on the blotter where the code had rested, and that the mark had the width and shape of his hand. He wiped at it with his fist, as if apologizing to Wood. Then he left small change on the desk for no one. Toward the middle of the day, Nora took the old photograph from its stand and carried it to the staff room to show the nurse. The nurse put her head near the picture without touching the plastic sleeve and said, "I know that stance," in the same tone she used for diagnosis not of illness, but of naps that hurt you and must be corrected with a better pillow. She put the picture back in the stand and considered the hands of the women in it, and then looked at Nora's hands resting on the desk as if comparing gloves on a counter. The next day, the county sent another man, not the one from before, with papers to sign and assurances that fans would be available for pickup at a drop point near the courthouse. His boots left a mark on the mat. He stood in the cool patch and did not notice that he had stopped there. He asked whether there had been unusual condensation. Nora said yes, and he made a mark with his felt pen that squeaked. He asked whether the downstairs continued to be kept closed. Nora said yes. He went to the staff hall and came back with a complaint in his throat about a must that, in his view, could only be handled by a scrub with a bleach solution. Nora did not tell him bleach cannot do anything about a room that knows you. He signed a paper and thanked her for her time and for their service to the town, and left. The door breathed, annoyed. It rained one day like a chore the sky had avoided. The smell came through every place a building breathes. The fish swam without comment. The cardboard sleeves on the holes got damp and left rings on the metal shelf. A child cried, trying to put a puzzle piece where it would not belong. His mother, as apology, folded itself into the room, as damp as if it had always lived there. The cool place by the far window became ordinary. The gap in reference opened and stayed. Nora did not fill it. She visited it and then left, marking herself against the shelf until her shoulder felt a decent ache. Another day, the air had a brightness to it that was not dryness, only the illusion of it. People moved faster in such air and then rested more suddenly. The volunteer nurse brought a small fan from home and set it on the admin desk, until Evelyn made her take it back, pointing at a line in a memorandum about power use and circuits that could not carry both giant and small burdens at once. The fan had left a ring on the desk as if it had been a pitcher set there with sweat sliding down its sides. The ring did not wipe. The desk accepted it into its grain the way the blotter accepted Nora's hand. Nora learned to stand in her place a little lighter so the desk would not groan under too much certainty. She learned to step into the handprint without wondering if she had been invited and to step out of it without apology. She learned to hear what she had been hearing all along, that the question had already been asked, and the answer could be given a little at a time without having to jump from a moving car. She brought a small cloth from home, a clean square from an old shirt, and folded it into a careful rectangle and kept it in the drawer under the desk. When a ring formed that wanted to be listened to before it faded, she laid the cloth beside it and let it do nothing. Doing nothing was its job. She felt better having the cloth. She did not use it. Once near close, she untucked it and set it over her hand without lifting her palm from the blotter. The cloth took on a shape from the damp and darkened at the bony parts, then lightened like a breath. She dried the cloth on the back of her chair when no one was around. It held the shape of her palm even when dry. That seemed like a danger, and she folded it tighter and put it farther back in the drawer. She began to speak to the room at the ends of days with words that meant nothing on their own and made something together. She would say, "There we are," or "That will do," or "I hear you," or "Not today." It was plain talk. It was as far as she would let herself go in a building that thought in the way water thinks when it has found a channel and cannot help but sing to itself. She did not tell anyone with ears. She did not speak to the nurse about it, and not to Evelyn. She kept her voice low and gave the words to the desk the way you give crumbs to birds and do not look to see if they take them. She took 2 days off when the sky finally decided to dust its hands and be clean. On the first day, she stood by the river and watched beer cans cruise along in a slow parade behind a snag of branches that had chosen their corner. The smell was iron and algae and fish and something like pennies warmed in a closed fist. The second day, she lay on her couch with the window open and let the afternoon scoop itself under her. In her half-sleep, she heard the library S noises come as faint ingredients, the scanner S note the fish's burp, the copy machine's breath the click that the light above the staff room door made when it evaluated itself. She woke smiling and then let the smile go because she had remembered that the library would be there without her today and did not require her for its arrangement. She pressed her pent-up self against a book from home and read nothing, letting the paper set the line of her breathing. When she went back, the air inside the building wore the cool of a basement kept in good repair and treated with affection. People came in the way they always did after a clear day, a little uncertain that things would remain generous. The nurse had left a note on the desk that said a child had come late in the day before and asked in a confident voice to see the gap. The nurse had sent the child to the picture books instead. The child had found a loose page under a chair and carried it around the library and then given it back with pride, as if it had been a lost animal returned to a family. Nora stood in her place and looked at the old photograph again. The two women in it had been captured with expressions that did not believe in cameras. They looked like they worked and then were asked to stand still and did not comply. She could not stop looking at their wrists, the way the bones held. She wondered if she were in a picture, how her hands would carry. She placed them on the blotter to check and felt ridiculous, and felt for a minute a little healthy warmth crawl into her ear, as heat will when a person sees themselves too clearly. The desk did not mind her self-regard. It accepted what she gave it and gave her back the feel of its damp, which had always been steady as breath. The river did what it does when it is too tired to rise. It receded a little under stones and then pushed out again, as if changing its mind. Days followed one another into something that was not routine so much as a learned friendship. The gaps continued, less insistent and more frequent, which made them easier to ignore until they were not. The cool place expanded and contracted with a logic that suited itself and did not seek hers. The handprints on the blotter deepened into darkness you cannot remove. They looked like a pair of hands on a table at the start of a talk a person might give at their own kitchen, telling the order of a day that had asked them where they belonged, and listening for the answer in the small sounds of a house that knows its people. In the end, there was no end. There was an evening that had trouble choosing its color. There was a woman at the desk with her palms damp from a walk and her mouth brushing the name of a book she could not remember and then saying never mind with a sorry that did not need forgiving. There was a fish that rose and fell, learning again how to be quiet. There was a copier that failed with a stutter and then woke with a polite cough. There was a photograph of two women with hands like hers. There was a desk that accepted her hands and kept their shape when she lifted them away. There was a gap in reference that opened small and closed gentle. There was a staff board that took the oval and then allowed it to fade and then took it again. The way people allow themselves to remember and then choose to put something back on a shelf where it will not injure them. There was Nora, standing where she had stood on the first day, deciding that the space a building makes for you is not a trap if you decide it is an address. There was the air, damp and patient. There were the shelves which are not alive and do not need to be in order to do their work as if they loved someone. There was the place in the carpet loops where her heels had taught the yarn how to hold. There was the cold on the floor near the window. There was the soft insistence next to reference. There was the slip with her name under the monitor. There were her hands, which will always be the size they are. When she closed, she did so cleanly, and the clacks of the latches sounded like words set in a row with the care of a person who values plain speech. She stood once more in the print as she had each night for a while, and felt the building nod back. She bent and took the cloth from the drawer and laid it over her palm, and then took it away again, smiling at herself for the superstition. She walked the aisles. She visited each gap and touched none of them. She let her hand graze the old atlas until the stillness climbed and then leveled. She said out loud to the room that she would be here tomorrow, and the room believed her because it knew she was honest with objects and with her own fatigue. In the dark, the desk kept its prints like shallow lakes. In the morning, they would look newly formed. They would ask their question without asking. She would answer without speaking each time she set her hands down and felt the paper cool her. She could have been anywhere a person stands to make themselves useful. She was here. The library had not taken her. It had kept a place. And when she stood within that place, she could feel the rooms behind rooms align the basement, cold decide not to reach too far. The gap accept that it would not have her today, and so wait another day, the board in the hall lift a face in water, and then put it away again. The town would go on with its fans and its notices and its unspoken belief in ordinary weather returning. It might return, it might not. Either way, her hands would leave their proof on the blotter. Either way, people would arrive bearing their own damp and their own names and set both down in front of her, and she would slide what they needed to where it wanted to rest and watch the stain lighten, polite as thanks. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.